Live from downtown Bloomington, this is IU Sports Sunday with Nick Rotacap on 98.7 The Zone.
Good morning and welcome to IU Sports Sunday here on 98.7 The Zone. Nick Rotacap with you as we have just celebrated Pi Day in Bloomington. That was yesterday, 3-1-4. And, well, Indiana basketball's season ended like an unappetizing pie to the face. One that you didn't want to eat, one that you weren't expecting, and it didn't even taste good. It was sardine-flavored pie. That's what it felt like at the Big Ten tournament earlier this week as Indiana men's basketball lost embarrassingly. It feels like Groundhog Day because I say that a lot, right? But Indiana men's basketball went out with a whimper. Went out without any semblance of urgency against the Northwestern Wildcats to finish the first season of the Darren DeVries era at a very pedestrian 18-14 and 9-11 in the Big Ten, 9-12 if you count the Big Ten tournament game against Northwestern. And I said this on the student radio broadcast of that game on WIUX Sports. It felt like if you were to take the resumes of those teams playing in that game blindly, you would have thought to yourself that Northwestern was the team playing to save its season. The Wildcats, led by Chris Collins and their star senior forward, Nick Martinelli, just completely ran circles around the Hoosiers. Nick Martinelli had a phenomenal night, day that ends in Y for him. 28 points for Martinelli in what was the final win of his college career as Northwestern's season ended the following day against Purdue. The Boilers playing in the Big Ten championship game today against Michigan. And I just could not, I guess, I don't want to say I couldn't believe what I was seeing, because I absolutely could believe what I was seeing, because it's happened so many times to Indiana basketball, not just under Darren DeVries this year, but in the past, in my time as a student under Mike Woodson. And I know you're thinking to yourself, oh, well, you're a student, you don't really know the history of IU basketball. Well, the history of IU basketball for most of my lifetime, if not all of my lifetime, and for the majority of the past 20 years, as written by the Indy Star's Zach Osterman, has been mediocrity. That's the new de facto standard for IU basketball. And I don't think that you can honestly say Indiana basketball is above tournaments not named March Madness anymore. I don't think that they've been above that echelon for a long time. I think nobody has accepted that yet. I think a lot of people are still in one of the first stages of grief, and that is denial. But the fact of the matter is, I said this before, I'll say it again. I am 22 years old. I am a senior at IU, and I have never seen the basketball team get past the Sweet 16. Never. Not once in my life. North Carolina State made a Final Four in my lifetime before Indiana did. That is the state of this program. And for some reason, regardless of the monetary or personnel investments made in the program, it remains mired in a middling result season after season. Talking about IU men's basketball here on IU Sports Sunday. I was at the United Center covering the Big Ten tournament this week. I almost blew away a couple days ago in Chicago walking into the arena because there were 60-mile-per-hour wind gusts, somewhere in that neighborhood anyway. And it was ridiculous. I actually did some research on why Chicago is called the Windy City, and it's a double entendre of sorts, because it's not just because of lake effect wind. I knew that lake effect wind was a thing. I knew that lake effect snow was a thing, which is crazy. And by the way, they might get pelted with some of that today. So if you are driving to Chicago right now, if you're a Michigan or a Purdue fan, then please be careful getting home, because it is going to be potentially very perilous on the roads. And it was very perilous a couple days ago. But another reason that Chicago is apparently called the Windy City is because of all the hot air coming out of politicians' mouths. And that's a moniker that goes back well over 100 years, maybe 150, 200 years, given that Chicago is a very old city. And, I was thinking to myself, man, it's amazing how some things never change, because you could tell me that name was given to Chicago yesterday, and I would say it's very fitting, and I would believe you. But I was not born yesterday. I was sitting at the United Center calling this game alongside Graham Nash, who is a very talented broadcaster. He is about to go work in the New York Yankees farm system as a media relations assistant and play-by-play broadcaster. And congratulations to Graham, who is probably the oldest 23-year-old I've ever met. He began his college career as a Division III golfer at Kenyon College in Ohio. And now he's calling games in the New York Yankees system. So shout out, Graham. I'm sorry that your IU student media career had to end like that. I was on color for Graham. And I'm just sitting up in the press box. This is the exact same press box I was sitting in when Indiana beat the snot out of Marquette back in November. And I'm thinking, man, how things have changed. And not for the better. Because what I saw in Indiana's Big Ten tournament loss to Northwestern earlier this week was a team that did not care that its season would likely end with a loss. That is what I saw. I don't know if that was the case, but that is the assessment that I made in the moment, and that is the assessment that I stick by. When you're calling a game, you think about things a little bit differently than somebody just watching it or covering it for a print outlet or shooting the game for a multimedia outlet or a local news station. You think about the game in terms of moments, because play-by-play by its very nature is extremely ephemeral. You are analyzing that particular moment and only that particular moment, and hopefully what you are able to do is add some context relative to the events of the game that have led to that point. And as I was calling this game, I was telling Graham Nash, my play-by-play broadcaster on IU Student Radio, I told him, hey, Graham, this feels a lot like the first game between Indiana and Northwestern, which was only about 3 weeks ago, and I did play-by-play for the first half of that game, and I was thinking, wow, I'm thinking, okay, Indiana gets off to a hot start. Nick Martinelli is relatively cold coming out of the gates, and Indiana can't put Northwestern away, which was the exact same thing that happened the first time. Again, I said earlier, it felt like Groundhog Day, and it was Groundhog Day. I don't like Punxsutawney Phil very, very much. I think he is very bad at his job. I think there are only 2 jobs in the world where you can be accurate under 50% of the time and keep your job. Actually, there are 3. Meteorologist, baseball player, and Punxsutawney Phil. Not a fan of that guy. Not a fan of whatever has been going on with the weather in Bloomington this spring. But in any case, I'm thinking, okay, Indiana's got a 10-point lead. We're about 10 minutes in. This is good. My concern is Nick Martinelli he's got like 4 points on 1 of 4 shooting, and as the Big Ten's best scorer, as one of the best scorers in the country, this guy averaged 22.5 points per game this season on efficient shooting. He wasn't a volume shooter. I am concerned because I know that Martinelli is going to heat up. It's just a question of when. And so I was thinking maybe Indiana could keep Northwestern at bay in this game, because out of the gates, it looked like Indiana had enough answers offensively to spell the Wildcats. Tucker DeVries had 5 early points. Lamar Wilkerson was off to a good start. No. I was lied to. I was hoodwinked, deceived, run amok, led astray, lied to, however you want to slice it. Because Tucker DeVries scored 5 points off the top of my head in the first handful of minutes. He finished the game with 6 points on 2 of 9 shooting. He also had 8 rebounds and 6 assists, so he was actually closer to a triple-double than you might think. The problem is it felt like his impact on the game was relatively minimal from a scoring perspective, and it was. He went ice cold after the first 5 points that he scored consecutively early in the first half. You can't have that from a guy who is supposed to be one of your primary scoring options. Lamar Wilkerson had 17, but Wilkerson had no help, which is a story that we have heard time and time again with this Indiana team this year. And as the game was going on, okay, Indiana's up 10. Okay, here comes Northwestern. And it wasn't Nick Martinelli who led the charge at first. It was Jake West. Jake West, man, that guy was a role player this year for the Cats. He was a role player. He was not a primary scoring option. He averaged 5 points a game. He averaged 2 made baskets per game. He did not have a crazy large scoring ledger. I mean, he scored in double figures 5 times in the regular season, maybe. He had 14 against Minnesota, 16 against IU the first time in that win. So I guess Indiana should have known better. But by and large, Jake West only had 3 other games in double figures against teams not named Indiana. So think about that. West, freshman out of Philly, 6'3", 170, a little bit undersized, but he looked phenomenal. He looked decisive. He looked quick. He made Indiana's defense look like a bunch of traffic cones on I-465, especially near Keystone, if you know what I'm talking about. Jake West, 18 points, 4 assists, 3 boards in 37 minutes. He made 50% of his field goals. It's a guy scored in double figures twice against Indiana in his freshman season. Twice against Indiana, 3 times combined against everybody else. That, to me, sounds like a game planning problem, an execution problem, a coaching problem, a scouting problem. A lot of problems. Muchos problemas for Indiana basketball. You're letting a role player score almost 20 points and keep Northwestern in the game before Nick Martinelli got going. And that was ultimately the key, was that the first time around when Indiana played Northwestern, yes, Jake West had 16 points, but I would argue that Indiana kept Northwestern from getting closer going into halftime because the offense was ticking a little better and the defense was ticking a little better as well. Because in the first meeting between these two teams, Indiana had a double-digit lead at halftime. That was one of the differences. This time around in the Big Ten tournament, it was a 1-point game at halftime. And it just didn't feel like there was ever one specific moment that hurt Indiana against Northwestern in the Big Ten men's basketball tournament. It was death by a million cuts, not 1,000 cuts, a million cuts. And I want to correct the record. Indiana led by 9 at halftime. The first time these teams met, the lead was as high as 11 early in the second half. And then from there, Northwestern went on to outscore Indiana in the second half, 39-26, and win 72-68. So, it's semantics, right? But this time around, Indiana was up by 1 at halftime, and Northwestern, it felt like Indiana was losing. It did. And that was what I said to Graham Nash on the broadcast. I'm thinking, this team just had no sense of urgency to continue to bury its opponent with the season on the line. And, yeah, I mean, to their credit, to Darren DeVries and his team's credit, at least they were winning at halftime in a do-or-die game. There were a lot of do-or-die games this year. The last one before the Big Ten tournament, Indiana trailed by 17 going into halftime. That was against Ohio State and Columbus, a game that Indiana ultimately lost 91-78. Well, the box score makes it look a little bit closer than it actually was. Michigan State, Indiana trailed by 8 at halftime. Indiana was never in that game against Michigan State. Against Purdue in Mackey Arena, another do-or-die game. Oh, Indiana trailed by 17 at halftime. You get the point. I could go on with the Purdue game, the Louisville game, the Kentucky game, et cetera, et cetera. There were a lot of them. Nebraska, Indiana led by 16 and lost 18 points. It was close to 20 points at one juncture in that game. Ultimately, it didn't matter. It didn't matter because the elephant in the room for Indiana men's basketball this year is that the Hoosiers, every single opportunity that they had to keep their season alive, they failed. And it's a shame that this season from Lamar Wilkerson was wasted. It's a shame that Indiana brought in one of its most electrifying scorers in a while, who could rain down the threes on the right night as good as anyone. When he got hot, he was on fire. Now, there is something to be said that most of Wilkerson's best performances came against subpar competition. I do think as far as a professional scouting standpoint, that is something that's going to be looked at. I don't know if he has a future in the NBA, but what I do know is he was electrifying to watch on his night. And it's a shame that nobody besides him even really showed up at the United Center, as Indiana's season is likely over. Now, the bubble this season, of course, Selection Sunday is today. The Big Ten Championship is the lead-in to the selection show. It's Michigan versus Purdue, which at the start of the conference tournament, I would not have picked Purdue to even win a game because Purdue was scuffling. They were coming off a senior night loss at home to Wisconsin. As we came to find out, Wisconsin was pretty darn good this year. But giving up 97 points to Wisconsin at home, I'm thinking, well, I don't know about Purdue's chances. Silly me. But I feel regret for Indiana because there is a very real chance that if the Hoosiers would have beaten Northwestern in the Big Ten tournament, they would be in, regardless of what would have happened against Purdue, because every other team on the bubble just insists on losing. They're trying to gift wrap an NCAA tournament appearance to Indiana. They got so much help, the Hoosiers did, from the other bubble teams, including but not limited to Miami of Ohio losing in the MAC quarterfinal to UMass, which, Redhawks, that's a bad look because you went from this PR push of, hey, look, we tried to play somebody who was highly ranked in the metrics, but everybody turned us down. We'll play anybody on any floor to, man, I don't want to play UMass on a neutral floor in the conference tournament. That's soft. That's soft. And in the words of Barack Obama, let me be clear that Miami of Ohio should still probably be in. That doesn't mean that people aren't going to point and laugh and say, I told you so, when the Red Hawks get boat raced in their first NCAA tournament game. Mentioned Auburn giving up a 21-0 run, I think it was, against Tennessee to surrender the lead and ultimately the game in the SEC tournament. You want to get people to watch the first four and be invested in the first four. Auburn versus Miami of Ohio in Dayton. Who says no? Who says no? That would be fun because I think Miami of Ohio would win, and then Bruce Pearl could finally shut the nepotism mouth of saying, oh, my son's team deserves to be in the NCAA tournament. No, he doesn't. No. 16-16? No. Auburn basketball, their social media push has been much more embarrassing than that of Miami of Ohio. Posting all these contrived stats pulled out of thin air, the kind of stats that you would find on an ESPN baseball broadcast. Auburn is trying to make its case on the bubble of the NCAA tournament where Indiana finds itself on likely the wrong side. Auburn, too, will be one of the teams not selected today. But the Tigers saying, oh, look, we are the first team to eat Cheerios for breakfast on a Tuesday in March and then have an effective field goal percentage over 37.5 while also having the best strength of schedule in the country and taking a charter bus to the airport in Auburn, Alabama. Stats like that. Stats that mean absolutely nothing. It is pathetic. It is embarrassing. And I owe Indiana a bit of credit at least for not trying to make the case in that fashion. Let it go, man. It's over. Indiana, despite other bubble teams trying to help it, does not deserve to be anywhere near the NCAA tournament field. Because the players don't care. That is what their play showed us in the Northwestern game earlier this week in the conference tournament. Your season is on the line. You should be playing like your hair is on fire, and instead you get outcoached and outplayed by a Northwestern team with literally nothing to play for besides the prospect of ruining your season. That's it. That is the only thing Northwestern had to play for. That and giving Nick Martinelli another day as a college basketball player. And huge props to Nick Martinelli. Because he could have gone somewhere else for the bag. He stuck with Chris Collins. And he will go down as one of the best players in Northwestern basketball history. One of two forwards in Wildcats history to score over 1,600 career points. He holds the single-season scoring record there. Said it last year. I think it's 646 points for Martinelli. Those are the only two things that they had to play for. And there was no urgency. It was complete apathy. It was pathetic. It was embarrassing. But given the recent state of Indiana basketball, it was not at all surprising. You're listening to IU Sports Sunday on 98.7 The Zone. Back here on IU Sports Sunday, Nick Rotocap with you here on 98.7 The Zone. Thanks so much for joining us on this March 15th. That is Selection Sunday. And Indiana basketball won't be there. They don't deserve to be there. If they are selected as an 11 seed, I will personally drive up to the NCAA headquarters in Indianapolis and voice my displeasure in a nonviolent yet stern manner. I will say, Dan Gavitt, I went to grade school with your son. I vehemently disagree with the decision that you and your colleagues have made. Semicolon, however, comma, I understand that I am powerless to change said decision. Or something to that effect. I'm not really going to do that. Gas is expensive enough these days. I don't need to do that. But that is what I would do, hypothetically, if this were the SEC, because I know they love their hypotheticals down there. It's just so that's how I would describe this season for Indiana men's basketball. I think back to early on when this team was clicking for about 3 games. 3 games. 3 games they were clicking. And I thought, wow, they could get back to the NCAA tournament. This could be a really successful season for Darren DeVries and company. And obviously that didn't happen, right? Obviously that didn't happen. And one of IU's assistant coaches on the postgame radio show with Don Fisher said something very interesting. It was Rod Clark who was on the show with Don Fisher. And I saw this through Twitter because I was calling the game at the United Center on IU Student Radio, so I did not have the chance to listen to it. But I saw the comments on Twitter. And he was talking about how in the second half of the Big Ten season, fatigue seemed to set in for this team. And how I think he was alluding to the physicality of the Big Ten, the travel, and everything that goes into playing a Big Ten basketball schedule, especially now with conference realignment. I mean, we saw that for Indiana men's basketball out west after the double overtime win over UCLA, playing USC a couple days later and just coming out completely dead, which I think was forgivable and understandable. But I think it's so weird. There's this conundrum because on one hand, obviously you need to understand that this was year one of a new head coach and that this could be considered a rebuilding year. Therefore, there should be some grace given to these guys, given the vast majority of them, save for Tucker DeVries in 8 games last year and Sam Alexis in a reserve role at Florida, did not play Power 4 college basketball in their careers prior to coming to Bloomington. You need to give them a little bit of grace for that and experiencing the physicality of the Big Ten for the first time and the travel and all of that. However, you cannot give them that grace because almost none of them are coming back. That's the thing that's so maddening. And that was the problem with this roster from the start, is that Darren DeVries brought in a bunch of elderly men. I say that relative to their competition. I know. Relative to their competition, these are old men. Guys 23, 24 years old. So their careers are over after this year. There is nothing for you to build on. There are no lessons for you to take forth with the core that you had this season. You are starting from zero again in year 2. That is not normal. And that is the problem with this team. The fans are obviously and understandably very frustrated at the product that has been on the floor, not just with DeVries, but before DeVries. And those frustrations, be that fair or not, are bleeding over onto his team. Of not making the NCAA tournament since my sophomore year, which was 2023-24. Or is that right? No, that's not right. I apologize. It was 2022-23, which was my freshman year. For some reason, I thought they made it back after they lost to Miami. No, they didn't. The years college runs together in my head sometimes. It gets kind of confusing. But in any case, not making the NCAA tournament since I was a freshman. That was now 3 years ago, 4 seasons ago, if you will. Not making the Sweet 16 in a decade. Never winning the Big Ten tournament, which, again, is one of the most absurd things that I've ever realized, is that Indiana men's basketball has never won the Big Ten tournament, but the conference tournament came around in the late 90s, after which Indiana had already won its 5th and to this date final national championship, made the Final Four for the penultimate time before making it back under Mike Davis in 2002, ultimately losing to Maryland. But that is still so absurd how unkind the Big Ten tournament has been to Indiana. And you would think, with the amount of times that it's been held in either Indianapolis or Chicago, that one of these times maybe Indiana would have just lucked its way into a Big Ten championship in the tournament. Nope, not happening. Indiana hasn't won the conference since the mid-2010s. And the guy who won those conference titles, Tom Crean, won a couple. In the 98.7 The Zone studios, I've got SportsCenter on right now. Tom Crean was just on the SportsCenter set. And I posted, admittedly, a little bit of an engagement bait post on Twitter, just because I wanted to do the bit where people say, oh, well, Mike Woodson did this and Darren DeVries didn't. Well, Mike Woodson made the NCAA tournament in year 1. I know it's apples to oranges. I know he had more talent on the roster. I know that firing him was the right decision, and I know that he never should have been hired. I also know that it was a play-in game against Wyoming, and then Indiana ultimately got screwed with travel, went out west, and got blasted by St. Mary's. I know that. But the facts are the facts, and I say this slightly in jest, but also slightly in a bit of painful comedy. Mike Woodson made the NCAA tournament in his first season. Darren DeVries likely will not. These are facts. This is true. Mike Woodson is owed a tiny bit of an apology. Just a little, not very much. We'll give him a little bit of grace, not much, but a little bit. The ultimate apology is owed to Tom Crean. Because Indiana won 2 Big Ten titles in less than 5 years with Crean. Things went south the year after the second Big Ten title, and then Indiana said, you're done. Hit the breadline. Shout out Megadeth. That's an underrated Megadeth song, Breadline, from an album that didn't do all that well. But Tom Crean fired. Indiana hasn't sniffed the same level of success that it had under Crean since he was sent out to pasture. Hindsight is a wonderful thing. Hindsight is a very wonderful thing. And I think there's another level of poeticness to this. I don't know if that's a word. It is now. That when Indiana played Marquette in the United Center, Tom Crean was a last-minute call-up for ESPN. He became the analyst for that game on that broadcast. Because I think the Indiana fans and the arena that day, back in November, may have been thinking to themselves, hey, Tom, we may have actually found your spiritual successor, and we may have gotten it right this time. And perhaps now we can move on. No. But I think it's poetic that in that same arena, it came to a definitive conclusion that no, we have not found Tom Crean's successor. And we might never find Tom Crean's successor. Somebody who can elevate this program to the level that he did, considering where he built it from, which was 0. Thank you, Kelvin Sampson, who, by the way, is still coaching at a very high level. I understand it was year 1 of Darren DeVries. And I understand that with the timing of his hiring being relatively late in conjunction with the portal and with the offseason beginning, there wasn't really a whole lot Indiana could do besides just go after the, I wouldn't say table scraps, because Lamar Wilkerson was not a table scrap, right? But go after the guys who had not yet been scooped up by other schools in building this roster. But I think it's just so disappointing that for all of the seniors that are leaving, Indiana gets nothing. No NCAA tournament. Are they going to get an invitation to the crown? Yes. Should they accept it? that's another thing where ordinarily I would say yes, because we saw what it did for Nebraska and the Huskers getting bounced from the Big Ten tournament, but still they're going to be a high seed in the NCAA tournament as they look to, let me check my notes here, win an NCAA tournament game for the first time ever. Ordinarily, I would say that Indiana should go that route. But when you don't have any key pieces coming back, and I know that you could say, well, Nick Dorn, Josiah Miles, Trent Sisley, the alleged Josh Harris and alleged Jason Drake, who were added to the roster but literally never played. They were injured the entire year. So why were they added to the roster? I mean, it's one thing if the injuries just did not progress at the level to which you thought they would for those guys, Josh Harris and Jason Drake, excuse me. But for them to be so injured, they didn't even sniff the possibility of playing. You get to a certain point in January or February, and you probably should just shut them down. That's ultimately, I think, what happened. But that is, whether it was known or not, that is a flaw. Because those are two roster spots you could have used on depth pieces. Indiana needed depth, sorely lacked depth this year. But with all these guys departing, Sam Alexis, Tucker DeVries, Connor Enright, Lamar Wilkerson, and others, Reed Bailey, although I think most people will be happy to see him go. Realistically, what would playing in the Crown do for you? If these guys didn't care when their March Madness hopes were still hanging on by a thread, who's to say that they're going to care in the Crown? They already got their NIL money. Tatum Connerway in the locker room after the game, not really remorseful for the season being over. Well, I started at the JUCO level, eating cardboard Domino's pizza, and I made it to the Big Ten, man. Which, don't get me wrong, every guy on that roster has more athleticism in their left pinky toe than I have in my entire body. I understand that. But from those of the members of the student media contingent with whom I am friends who were in that locker room, said that outside of Connor Enright, there were no real emotions, which is not the way teams normally react when they know that their season is over. The general consensus was that they were relieved that it was done. And you get that quote from Tatum Connerway, I made it to the Big Ten, man. I'm not JUCO anymore. I was eating cardboard Domino's pizza, and now I'm not. By the way, Domino's was one of the sponsors at the United Center, so I think that's really funny. Maybe they slipped him a 20 to say that. I don't know, but it didn't sound like he was lifting up Domino's, if you will. My point is, the players didn't care on the floor. The players did not show, except for Connor Enright, that they cared after the game. So if the players don't care, if Darren DeVries is just going to stand on the sidelines with his arms crossed, mute, I know he's never gotten into it with officials in his career. What was Chris Collins doing? I know Chris Collins has a very different personality to Darren DeVries. Chris Collins, after a questionable no call that went Indiana's way, was in the ensuing TV timeout at the top of the key, slapping his forearm, yelling at the official that one of his players got fouled and that it should have been called. That's what you have to do in the Big Ten. You got to work the officials because, by George, they stink something fierce sometimes. They do. I mean, you saw that with the Illinois-Wisconsin game. Awful officiating. Putrid. Terrible. Rotten eggs. That's what that was. You've got to work the officials a little bit. But Darren DeVries just standing on the sidelines, arms crossed. No semblance of, I don't know. No fire, which I understand that's his personality. He's kind of understated. But I would have liked at least once in one of those blowout losses that Indiana had, Ohio State, Purdue, Illinois, etc. I would have liked for him to get a technical. Just maybe to fire up his players. Don't do what Mike Woodson did in the Big Ten tournament against Nebraska in 2024 when he just got ejected and went off with a whimper because he couldn't get him over the hump. No, show some fire. Get your guys amped up a little bit. Fight for your guys like Chris Collins does, running out on the floor and slapping his forearm and saying, hey, that should have been a foul. Instead of just resigned, arms crossed, not leaving the coach's area. in front of the scorer's table, you got to show a little bit of something. A little bit of something, because if the players don't care, if the coaches don't care, I'm not saying Darren DeVries doesn't care. I'm not saying that. But that's the appearance that it gave off throughout the game, especially on Wednesday at the United Center. If the first parties involved do not care, why should the fans care? Why should the fans invest not only their time but their money into another multi-million-dollar roster next year, seeing what their investments got them in year one? And I know that the expectations were perhaps a little bit too high, but I'm not going to apologize for the fans that still hold Indiana basketball to the standards that were set by Bob Knight and to the standards that Tom Crean tried to lift this program back to after it was stripped for parts following the departure of Kelvin Sampson. Because I don't think that it should be an outlandish goal just for Indiana to make the NCAA tournament every year. You talk about the history of Indiana basketball. There were two things that were pretty much guaranteed. One was beating Northwestern, and the other was making the NCAA tournament. Missing the big dance was something that just didn't happen in the past. It wasn't a question of if Indiana was going to get in. It was a question of how far it was going to go. And now, year in and year out, no matter the coat of paint, no matter the shiny new toy that's under the tree at Christmas, it just ends up being one big disappointment. And with the success of football here in Bloomington, with head coach Curt Cignetti, he and Heisman winner Fernando Mendoza honored by the Maxwell Award folks yesterday, the Maxwell Football Club, I beg your pardon, honored by them yesterday with what Curt Cignetti has built in such a short time. I would not be shocked to see even more fan support, both in terms of bodies and dollars, going towards football. And I wouldn't blame the fans, because that investment at least yields some sort of positive ROI. The basketball program hasn't done that in a while. Has not done that in a while. And maybe it's, I don't know if it's, I don't want to say it's time to accept that IU basketball is mediocre, but that is the long-term trend that we have seen with this program. Again, IU students have never been alive to see their team make it past the Sweet 16. That is not a standard of excellence. That is not the standard that a blue blood with 5 national championships should be held to. Oh, maybe we'll make the tournament. Man, I really hope we get an at-large. No, there should be no doubt. But there's not. There's not. I said this on the student radio broadcast earlier this week. I will say it again. Ryan Carr, the new general manager for Indiana basketball, has possibly the toughest job in Bloomington right now as far as IU athletics is concerned. Because there is more pressure now in year 2. But oh, by the way, you have no key returners. Good luck. You're listening to IU Sports Sunday. Welcome back to IU Sports Sunday. Nick Rotacap with you here in Bloomington. And folks, the weather continues to be very strange. IU softball had to move their game up from 1 o'clock to 11 o'clock today against Rutgers. If you can't make it, fear not. I'll be on the call for IU Radio. But that means I've got to get there straight after this show ends here, about an hour and 12 minutes from now. We're under a wind advisory here in Bloomington. We're going to have wind gusts as high as about 60 miles an hour. And the temperature, the high today, 70. The low tomorrow morning, 22. Woof. Tuesday morning, 15 degrees. Next Saturday, 73. That's not normal. 58-degree variance over the course of about 5 days. Not cool. But IU softball, if you want a bright spot in this athletic department, look no further than the program led by Shauna Stanton. And no, they don't pay me to say that. They don't pay me much of anything. They don't pay me anything. Wish they did. That'd be pretty cool. But the day I make money calling games is the day that I will know that I have made it, and probably the day I will have to spend some of that money on more suits, because there are only so many different combinations you can make with 2 suits and a handful of dress shirts and 3 ties. But I've tried my best. IU softball approaching the halfway point of its season. Yes, they're approaching the halfway point in mid-March. college athletics administrators as a collective need to understand that diamond sports should not be played in February and March, but here we are. IU softball 26 games into a 60-game regular season, 21-5. That's your bright spot. They've won 5 in a row. The offense continues to terrorize opposing pitching staffs. Yesterday, IU softball locked up its second Big Ten series in as many weekends, following up a 12-2 5-inning run rule victory over Rutgers with a 6-1 win against the Scarlet Knights. Indiana will go for the sweep here in just over 2 hours' time. If it was just under 2 hours, I'd really be in trouble. As for the home games, here in Bloomington, you can catch the team in action on Wednesday against IU Indianapolis. Monday, March 23rd, the weekend following against Oregon as well. And their next home conference series after this weekend will be in early April against Purdue. So hopefully the weather a little bit better by then, consistently at least. It's going to be 70 today, but it's going to be so windy. I don't envy the job of the outfielders in this one coming up between Indiana and Rutgers. As for Indiana baseball, the less said about them, the better. The less said about them, the better. 7-11 on the season, 1-4 in Big Ten play. In the early going, they are in Eugene, Oregon, are the Hoosiers. They have lost back-to-back games. Lost a pitcher's duel on Friday, 3-2. Lost yesterday, 5-1 to the Ducks. Oregon is always good in baseball. Always good. Indiana will look to avoid getting swept today in Eugene at 3:30 p.m. Eastern. And, oh, by the way, it doesn't get any easier because Indiana will then head to Nashville for a midweek game against Vanderbilt. Eesh. And the frustrations with this program mounting by the loss. And I understand. I get it. Baseball season is long. They still have time to turn it around. They're only 18 games into a 56-game regular season. The problem is each passing weekend. Last weekend, for example, the rubber match against Washington. Indiana won the Friday night game, got blown out on Saturday, had a chance to still win the series on Sunday. Hoosiers took an early lead. Washington responded in a big way. The Huskies catcher, Colton Bauer. Frankly, I had never heard of Colton Bauer. I'm not really well versed in Pacific Northwest baseball, but I learned Colton Bauer's name. I learned his name because Colton Bauer against Indiana in the rubber match last Sunday, a guy who had only hit 8 home runs in his career, was a career 180 hitter entering the season, batting 8th in Washington's lineup in the rubber match. Colton Bauer against Indiana's pitching staff on Sunday last week went 4 for 5 with 3 homers and a triple and 6 RBIs. And that triple was a Little League home run because Indiana threw the ball away and Bauer came around to score. That is a pretty good encapsulation of this season for Indiana baseball, allowing a career 180 hitting catcher to hit 3 homers and lose 13-4 in the rubber match of a 3-game series. I'm shaking my head. I know you can't see it, but I'm shaking my head. I know baseball is a silly sport, and sometimes things like that happen, but what I can't understand is why it seems to happen so much. Why does baseball happen so much to Indiana? I know they won the Big Ten in 2019. I know with the addition of the 3 West Coast schools the 4 West Coast schools, I should say. There are only 3 West Coast schools in softball. With the addition of the 4 West Coast schools, the Big Ten has gotten even deeper. But I also know that at some point you got to say enough is enough because this is the 3rd year in a row that this kind of story arc has happened. Indiana mired in mediocrity, can't seem to get, dare I say, over the hump with Jeff Mercer at the helm. I know Jeff Mercer's a great guy. I covered the program for 3 years. He's a good recruiter. He can clearly bring in talent. The problem is he can't coach. Sound familiar? That's pretty much exactly what happened with Mike Woodson. Apples to oranges, 2 different sports, 2 entirely different operations, but the same trend emerging. Good recruiter, lots of talent, underachieving to expectations year over year. Rumor has it Jeff Mercer's contract is up after this year. I would not be surprised if Indiana decides to go a different direction. Because with the amount of talent that's being brought in, the amount of guys that are being drafted, Indiana should be doing better as a program than it is. finding creative ways to lose games and disappoint fans. It's already hard enough to generate fan interest in Big Ten baseball because the Big Ten, by and large, as a baseball conference, is a joke. That's just how it is. You talk to college baseball players around the country, they laugh at the Big Ten. I have experienced that firsthand. I have seen it and heard it with my own eyes and ears. And Indiana can be near the top of the Big Ten. We've seen it. Problem is, that ship has sailed. Indiana hasn't been near the top of the Big Ten now in 4 years. 4 seasons, I guess. 2022-23. That was Indiana's best season since it won the Big Ten in 2019. I think enough is enough, though. Might have to consider going a different direction moving forward because this program is stuck dead in the water. And with the guys that they brought in, they should not be dead in the water. You're listening to IU Sports Sunday. Back here on IU Sports Sunday, Nick Rotacap with you. Thanks so much for joining us. Here, the halfway point in the month of March, and that means Selection Sunday is today. Indiana should not have its name called. Sorry to be the bearer of bad news, but when you look downright pathetic and embarrassing to the institution which you represent, time and time again with your season on the line, you do not deserve to have your season continue in the field of 68. I don't make the rules. I just try to follow them. And as far as Indiana is concerned, I don't know where they go from here. I hope Darren DeVries and Ryan Carr know where they go from here. I know they've got a good high school recruiting class coming in with Von Carvalho and Prince Alexander Moody. Are they going to have anybody else on the roster with them? I don't know. But what I do know, being at the Big Ten men's basketball tournament on Wednesday night as Indiana took on Northwestern looking to snap a 6-game losing skid against the Wildcats. Well, Indiana did not snap that losing skid. And I said this earlier on the show. I said it on the student radio broadcast on Wednesday night that it felt like Groundhog Day with respect to the first time Indiana played Northwestern this year. Hot start, failed to pull away. Northwestern stays in it and ultimately comes away with a win. The difference between the first meeting between these teams and the meeting on Wednesday in Chicago is that this meeting was in doubt at halftime. Indiana was up by 9 the first time these teams played, but this time around it was a 1-point game, and in the building it felt like Indiana was losing. I thought that Tucker DeVries was going to have more of an impact on this game based on how he started pretty well. He had 5 early points, 5 consecutive points for Indiana. He looked confident pulling the trigger from deep. He finished 1 of 5 from 3, 2 of 9 from the floor, 6 points, 8 rebounds, 6 assists. So he still impacted the game, but not in a scoring fashion. Lamar Wilkerson was the only Indiana starter in double figures. Connor Enright had as many turnovers as he did points. That's not good. Reed Bailey in 27 minutes only attempted 1 shot. He made 6 free throws, to his credit. He got to the line. Only attempted 1 shot from the floor and only grabbed 1 rebound. Sam Alexis, Indiana trying to run 2 bigs. The Hoosiers running out 2 bigs in the starting lineup for the first time all season in game 32. That doesn't seem like a good decision. I understand maybe you're in the regular season, your team's in a little bit of a slump. You want to mix things up. You maybe had a little bit of an extended off period where you tried to establish the chemistry between the 2 bigs, and you're thinking, all right, let's try it in a game. Okay. If that was what Darren DeVries did, I'd be on board. Sign me up. But to run 2 bigs in a starting lineup for the first time all season in the conference tournament in a game you have to win. I'm not a basketball coach. I never claimed to be a basketball coach. But that just seems a little bit interesting. I raise my eyebrow at that sort of thing because I don't necessarily understand the logic behind it. It would be one thing if it was December and Indiana was, say, coming off a loss to Minnesota where rebounding was a problem. And Darren DeVries said, all right, well, we got a couple games here against subpar competition. Sam, Reed, two bigs, get on the floor together, see what you can do. But for the two bigs combined to score 12 points, grab 2 rebounds, when they both played over 20 minutes, I don't get that. And I saw that on the stat feed when the starting lineups were published in Indiana's game against Northwestern in the Big Ten men's basketball tournament. Indiana playing both Sam Alexis and Reed Bailey at the start. I raised my eyebrow a little bit because I agree with the idea that Nick Dorn should not have been in the starting lineup for this game. I understand where Darren DeVries was coming from with that. I think that Nick Dorn should have been taken out of the starting lineup long before he was. But I don't think that the answer was playing two bigs. I don't. You look at you look at Nick Dorn's, I call it his Linsanity run. Shout out Jeremy Lin. But you look at Nick Dorn's run in late January. The best part of his season spanned 11 days. That's it. 11 days, 4 games for Nick Dorn. 4 games. That was the highlight of his campaign. Michigan, 14 points. He earned his first start against Rutgers with the injury to Tatum Conaway, where he scored 23, then 18 against Purdue in the win at Assembly Hall, which will remain one of the most puzzling results this season. And then at UCLA, of course, his season high, 26 points in Indiana's double overtime win, in which Dorn played 48 of 50 minutes. That was it. That was it. That was his whole season. He only got into double figures twice for the rest of the campaign, February and 3 games in March. And both of those instances were games where he scored 11 points against terrible teams. Oregon, which, the Ducks were one and done in the Big Ten tournament. They scored 12 points in the first half against Maryland. So that's where their season ended up. And Minnesota, a team that was running with 6 available players due to injury and illness and premature departures and that sort of thing. So all that is to say, Nick Dorn probably should have been taken out of the starting lineup, perhaps, either after he scored no points in 28 minutes against Wisconsin, or he scored 1 point on 0 of 5 shooting against Illinois, or he put up a big fat crescent donut, shout out Crescent Donuts, against Purdue in Mackey Arena in 25 minutes and repeatedly got hunted on defense and looked like a traffic cone. But for some reason, Darren DeVries refused to adjust the starting lineup until probably the last occasion that you would want to try something new. And I did not ask Darren DeVries about this after the Northwestern game because I was calling the game, and it would have been impossible to get down there in time. Because the print media, they usually go down at the last media timeout. That way they're ready to go. I was not ready to go, admittedly. I don't know if anybody asked Darren DeVries about the prospect of playing two bigs for the first time in the starting lineup in the conference tournament, but that just seems like a very odd decision to me. There were a lot of odd decisions. Like, why did I think that this game against Northwestern would somehow be any different from the previous 6 that Indiana had lost against the Wildcats up to that point, which is Northwestern's longest winning streak against Indiana in program history, and this series goes back over 120 years. And you know what I hate about this whole thing, about Indiana, for some reason, being the one team that Northwestern just owns, is that I have to listen to their student media gloat about it. Yeah, it's a point of pride. So what? It gets me annoyed when I see Northwestern student media point and laugh at IU. I can't say anything back because they're right. They're right. I'm sure Purdue doesn't have student media, but I'm sure that Purdue's regular media get very annoyed when they point out that Braden Smith, Fletcher Lawyer, and Trey Kaufman-Renn will finish their illustrious careers 4-4 against Indiana. Braden Smith will finish his career with a reputation for putting up stinkers at Assembly Hall. I'm sure Purdue media and fans are annoyed about that. I'm annoyed that the fine folks at Medill up in Evanston, not Chicago, Evanston, get to gloat about Indiana losing 7 in a row to Chris Collins and the Wildcats. I'm annoyed by that. I got into Medill. I didn't go because they wanted to take my kidney as payment. But I'm annoyed at the Northwestern student media folks because they get to point and laugh, and I don't get to point and laugh. And if there's one thing I like, it's pointing and laughing. But right now, the laughter is all directed at Indiana men's basketball. Playing with your hair on fire is something that a lot of teams probably would tend to do if they knew that their season was on the line. Indiana did not do that. Indiana didn't look like they even wanted to be there, let alone win the game. The standards that this program used to have are so far gone by the wayside at this point. It is laughable. It's laughable. It is very telling, I think, the state of where we are in college sports, where guys come in, they get money before they ever do anything, and then shocker, they don't really seem all that distraught. Some of them, not all, some of them don't seem all that distraught when the season comes to a premature end. Only one Division I men's basketball team gets to end its season happy. Okay, this season 3, I guess, the CBI got canceled, but you also have the NIT and the Crown. But only one ends its season happy with the grand prize, right? National championship. The other 364 end disappointed. I get that. But in the past, before NIL, I'm going to stop calling it NIL because that's not what it's become. It's pay for play. That's what it is. There are people who call it that. I used to not be one of those because, well, you got to, walk the straight and narrow. No, it's pay for play. You're paying these players to play for your school. You are not paying them to show up in an air conditioner commercial or sell T-shirts. That is not what NIL has become perverted into. It is pay for play. And in this era of pay for play, Indiana has tried to buy players now multiple years in a row, and it hasn't worked. And at the end of the season, when all is said and done, especially this year, you've got players talking about, oh, well, I was eating Domino's pizza at the JUCO level, and I made it to the Big Ten. Which, again, as I said in the first hour, don't get me wrong, making it to this level in your chosen sport is a massive feat in and of itself. However, you would think that a veteran like Tayton Connerway, who was the one who expressed that sentiment on Wednesday night, would know how to read the room a little bit better. That's something you say in a day after retrospective where you're thinking, man, my career is over, but I'm really proud of the accomplishments and I'm thankful for my teammates and that sort of thing. In the moment, you'd like to hear something to the tune of, we did not play the way we wanted to. Sorry to our fans. Our season is over and we are the most disappointed ones out of all of you. We wanted better. Something like that would have been nice. But no. I got my money. I don't care anymore. That you're going to hear a lot of that. And it's a far cry from what coaches in the past preached and lived by, from what Bob Knight preached. Why does Indiana not have names on the backs of its jerseys? Because you're playing for the name on the front. Well, that's not what it looked like on Wednesday night at the United Center. It didn't look like the players were playing for each other, for their team, for their coach, for their fans, who, by the way, IU fans outnumbered Northwestern fans in Chicago. Northwestern, Chicago's Big Ten team, I know they have a smaller alumni base because it's much harder to get in, and I know that IU's alumni network is heavily based out of the Chicagoland area. I get that. I just thought it was really embarrassing for Indiana that its fans outnumbered Northwestern in Northwestern's own city, I say with air quotes, and the team completely no-showed and failed the test because it was hungover and spent all night at upstairs, I say facetiously, the night before the game. Not playing for the name on the front, not even playing for the name on the back, because if they were playing for personal pride or for bragging rights or for their egos, maybe they would have shown a little bit more fight when Northwestern was fighting back. But Indiana couldn't get a stop worth anything. And I understand Nick Martinelli is going to be a very successful professional basketball player. I know that he is good. But time and time again this year, Indiana has had these halves, not just stretches of a game, but halves within a game where it scores under 25 points. It has happened so many times, it's maddening. How many points did Indiana score in the second half against Northwestern? 24. Indiana went into the locker room with a 1-point lead and got outscored by 14 in the second half. Northwestern 38, Indiana 24. How many times this year have we seen that happen? Did we see that happen? I will use past tense instead of past progressive because the season is over. Period. End of story. How many times have we seen Indiana just die offensively in these games? Not just cold stretches, not just slumps, a 3-4 minute drought, extended droughts. It's had so many times this year. Against Northwestern in the first meeting, Indiana scored 26 points in the second half. Against Purdue, Indiana scored 29 points in the first half. Against Illinois, a game where Indiana ended with 51 points. 20 points in the second half. That was a season low. Those kinds of halves were so common. There were no adjustments. There was no semblance of an answer. On the coaching side, on the execution side, Indiana's entire offensive game plan, at least so it appeared against Northwestern, was Lamar Wilkerson down there somewhere. See, that game plan works sometimes. In some sports, in some situations, for example, Patrick Mahomes and Tyreek Hill, Tom Brady and Randy Moss, right? These phenomenal, all-time great combinations of players who make each other better. But Lamar Wilkerson versus everybody else doesn't work. Doesn't work. And I said this on the broadcast on Wednesday night. Lamar Wilkerson this season was Lamar Wilkerson this season was the Bugatti in a trailer park for Indiana basketball. He was the lone gem in a sea of nothingness. And I think it's fitting that Wilkerson was the guy who routinely, and especially when it all came down to it, gave it everything he had, even when it was likely in vain. Because Wilkerson came from nothing. He came from nothing. He was working a factory job out of high school before he got a call from a Division II coach. He came from a tiny town in Arkansas. Got a call from a Division II coach because there wasn't very much Division I scouting interest in his area. Ultimately said, well, basketball is the only way I'm going to make a better life for myself and my family, so I'm going to go do it. Because he hated his factory job. He said he couldn't. He saw the way that his coworkers were worn down. He said he didn't want to end up like that. So he tried to make it in basketball. What did he do when he transferred to Indiana? He donated 6 figures of his NIL money to Sam Houston State, the school at which he spent multiple years to begin his career after he transferred from the Division II level. He also gave his mother a brand new Cadillac Escalade after senior day. Lamar Wilkerson is a good kid. I say kid, he's older than me. Lamar Wilkerson is a good person. A good young adult. There we go. We'll use that. And I think it's oddly fitting that he was the one who gave the most, who seemed to care the most out of anybody with the season on the line. Because he came from the least. And this meant something to him. Unfortunately, nobody else really seemed to care. There was no urgency. There was no, oh crap, we better figure this thing out now, otherwise the consequences might be dire. It didn't happen. There were no adjustments. There was no fire from Darren DeVries. I would have liked to see him work the officials the way Chris Collins did, the way Tom Izzo does, the way every successful coach tends to do. Greg Gard, Dusty May, right? I saw it firsthand. Brad Underwood, right? But no. Arms crossed on the sidelines, apathetic, muted, etc. It just, I don't know where Indiana men's basketball goes moving forward. Because most coaches in year one will have some growing pains. But at the end of it, there are usually some signs of good things to come with the players that the coach brought in. But Indiana was inherently doomed from the very beginning because Indiana brought in a bunch of geriatric basketball players with 1 year of eligibility left. And now you're pretty much going to be right back at zero entering the 2026-27 season. With Darren DeVries in his second season at the beginning of another de facto rebuild. And when the coaching staff expresses, well, we're thankful to the seniors who sacrificed a year of their career to help us get this program off the ground, you're going to have people raising their eyebrows a little bit. That's what Rod Clark said, the IU assistant, talking to Don Fisher after the game on Wednesday. Indiana's lost to Northwestern in the Big Ten tournament. But that doesn't really make sense because it would be one thing if there were just a couple seniors, maybe Tucker DeVries and another guy brought in to mentor a younger group. Say, all right, guys, you've got the keys to the car now. Don't wreck it. But the seniors were the ones driving the car all year. They have nobody to whom they can hand off the keys. The car is empty, but it's still speeding down the highway, trying to get over the hump. And it's not happening. It's not happening. You look at the production for Indiana that's leaving after this year. Your leading scorer, Lamar Wilkerson, gone. Your number 2 scorer, Tucker DeVries, gone. Number 3, Connerway, gone. Sam Alexis, out of here. Reed Bailey, out of here. Your top 5 leading scorers are all gone. Nick Dorn, I'd be okay with him leaving because he was so streaky, and once teams figured out how to guard him, his presence was effectively neutralized. Your leading rebounders, 1 through 6, all gone. Your leading assist men, Enright, DeVries, Connerway, all out of here. You get the point. Indiana, after 1 year of Darren DeVries, is effectively right back where it was after Mike Woodson was fired. No returning production. No semblance of plan for what the roster is going to be. So what was the point of this? What was the point of this being the way that Darren DeVries built his roster? I know his hiring took place, it was actually about this time last year because I was on a spring break trip with my friends in Louisville. Yeah, scenic Louisville, Kentucky, when DeVries was hired. And that was this time last year. It was actually a week later than this time last year. So his options as far as transfer portal pickings were perhaps a little bit thinner than they otherwise could have been. But I think IU fans would be a little bit more content with this season playing out the way it did if the team was young. But the team is old. And like I said, you're going to be right back at zero next year. And I don't really know how invested the fans are going to be. Because they're probably saying to themselves, this is what I would say to myself, I don't want to see the same movie again. I already know how it ends. I don't want to invest my money in this team, be it buying tickets, buying merchandise, concessions, or donating to NIL. Pay for play. Not NIL, it's pay for play. I don't get money from Hoosiers Connect. Pay for play. That's what it is. So they can buy another roster and maybe do something with it. Maybe. But when Rutgers' season goes longer than Indiana's, that's a bad sign. Rutgers went deeper into the Big Ten tournament than Indiana did. It's true. It's true. They were playing later. Rutgers actually played like they cared. Minnesota played like they cared. They only had 6 guys available, one of whom was a true freshman. At least Nico Medved actually played his true freshman, Kai Shinholster, for the Minnesota Golden Gophers. Trent Sisley didn't play worth anything after January, in January even. He hit the game-icing free throw against UCLA, and that was it. And every time I asked about Trent Sisley, I got a non-answer. So, that lifelong IU kid grew up playing, dreaming of playing for this school. He's going to transfer, I bet. I don't have that on good authority, but if you read between the lines, it's pretty easy to figure out that that's what's going to happen. Sisley's going to be out of here. That's just how it is. Because effectively, Indiana wasted a year of Sisley's eligibility. Darren DeVries barely played him. And my gripe with that is that Sisley is like the one guy I'd like to have back on this team. Now, if Nick Dorn figures out how to adjust to teams guarding him, I'd like him back too. But Sisley's the one young guy who's going to be coming back. Maybe. Would have liked for him to get minutes just to develop, to get experience in game action playing against somebody other than his own teammates. And I'm kind of befuddled as to why, when Indiana was getting the brakes beaten off of him, time and time again, down the stretch this season, Illinois, Purdue, Michigan State, Ohio State, second half against Northwestern, why did Sisley at least not get a shot? Because he couldn't have been much worse than the players that were out there on a routine basis. That's what I don't get. That is what I don't understand. I'm not saying he would have been any better, but he couldn't have been any worse. And he could have benefited from the developmental opportunity. It's kind of like when C.J. Gunn made a few threes against, I think it was Purdue in 2024. That was the game that Zach Edey made his first and only career three-pointer in college. C.J. Gunn made some threes to make the score a little bit less ugly. Look, C.J. Gunn was not a good rotation player for Indiana, but Mike Woodson at least understood the value of letting those guys get minutes when obviously the guys who were supposed to produce weren't going to do so. Does Trent Sisley have some sort of dirt on Darren DeVries? I don't know. That's the only explanation I have. Because Sisley couldn't even get garbage time minutes. I don't understand. And I know in the minutes that he had, the meaningful minutes in December and January, he played like a true freshman. That's all the more reason to, when the game is out of hand, get him more than 2 minutes in garbage time when nobody's trying. That's all I'm saying. It didn't happen. Now he goes into year 2 effectively with a wasted year of eligibility, not knowing whether or not he's going to even come back to Indiana in Trent Sisley in the men's basketball program. And when IU professors are spending the first part of their classes, this happened on at least one occasion during the middle of the season, spending the first part of their class dunking on the men's basketball team in a class which Sisley's sister is attending, that's not a good way to do things. Look, I understand sometimes professors want to make small talk with their students. I get it. How do you do, fellow kids? Right. But you can do it without disparaging the players. You just say, oh, man, basketball was rough last night. Yeah, well, hope they can turn it around. All right, anyway, today's lesson. And for the Kelley School of Business, all right, kids, today we're going to learn how to color in between the lines with colored pencils. I'm kidding. That's a joke. Take a joke. I'm sarcastic sometimes. Big deal. But what's not sarcastic is that Indiana is completely lost. And I do not envy the job of Ryan Carr, the new general manager. The early returns from the Darren DeVries era are that in 1 year in Bloomington, he did pretty much the exact same thing he did last year at West Virginia, which was show some flashes, but ultimately miss the NCAA tournament, probably being on the wrong side of the bubble. 19-13, West Virginia was a season ago. Indiana, 18-14 this year. Same head coach. Darren DeVries, 10-10 in the Big 12. 4 wins over ranked teams. This year, I don't even know if Indiana beat a ranked team besides Purdue. Marquette wasn't ranked. Ranked opponents, Kentucky. Kentucky wasn't ranked. Purdue, or Louisville, I should say, no. Illinois, no. Nebraska, no, etc. I don't know where Indiana goes. But donor fatigue is a real thing. And I think this is now multiple years in a row. Sizable monetary investment. The purported number, low 7 figures. Low 8 figures, I should say. Around the $10 to $12 million range for the roster each in the last couple of years. That's the purported number. I don't know how true that is because NIL is a weird thing. Pay for play is a weird thing where teams don't actually have to say how much they spend. It's not public. So all you have are rough estimates and approximations. But donor fatigue is going to set in. Hey, guys, we need to buy another roster. Open up those checkbooks. But the result, the last couple of years, has not warranted that investment. And as the years go on, if the mediocrity continues, fans are going to say, well, I don't know if you guys deserve my hard-earned money anymore. I'm looking over at football. And I'm looking at what they're doing with comparatively less NIL spending relative to the competition. And I like that because that is somewhere where I might actually see results. Thank you, Curt Cignetti. There was this narrative that Indiana bought this roster on the football side with Mark Cuban's money. That's not true. Not true. Anybody who knows anything knows Mark Cuban did not buy this roster. It's not that Indiana spent a ton of money in football. It's that they spent money on the right guys. A lot of whom they could have been recruited by anybody, but they weren't. They were overlooked. Curt Cignetti is an elite talent evaluator. And the difference between the trajectories of the football and basketball programs right now cannot be more different. You're going to see donor fatigue set in, and I'm willing to bet that if the donors continue donating money, they're going to say, hey, make sure this goes to football and not to basketball. You're listening to IU Sports Sunday. Back here on IU Sports Sunday, Nick Rotacap with you. Thanks so much for joining us on this third Sunday in March. I thought Curt Cignetti had a very good quote last night. He was being honored once again, which is, a very common occurrence for him. But Cignetti and Fernando Mendoza also being recognized by the Maxwell Football Club. Cignetti winning the George Munger Award, which was given to the Maxwell Football Club's Coach of the Year. Shocker, right? Curt Cignetti wins Coach of the Year. But Cignetti had a good quote during his speech yesterday. And I wish that I could find it. I had it. I lost it. It was something to the tune of Cignetti saying, how are we going to maintain, being asked, not saying, Cignetti being asked, how are we going to maintain this? No, we don't want to maintain anything. We've got to get better. Says the guy coming off of a 16-0 national championship season in which his quarterback won the Heisman and countless players received All-American and All-Conference honors. He's a psychopath. He is a psychopath, but that's the right mindset to have as far as college football goes. Because now that Indiana's gotten to the top of the mountain, they are the team with the biggest target on their back. The Hoosiers, the kings of college football right now, but a year from now, it might be somebody different. And it's up to Cignetti to make sure that that doesn't happen. Earlier this week, they took down the victory flag, which had been up, since Indiana beat Old Dominion. Actually, there was a little bit of a brief absence because of high winds and a mechanical malfunction. But notwithstanding that, the victory flag has been up for months. And now it's not. It's gone. They've turned a new leaf over to the 2026 season. And that's the right mindset to have. You can't get complacent. Cignetti did not get to this point in his coaching career. His players did not get to be as successful as they have been by virtue of being content with where they are. Always striving for improvement. I said it in the last segment. I don't think that the difference between the football program and the basketball program right now could be much more pronounced because basketball has just been stuck in this cycle. Ever since Trace Jackson Davis and Jalen Hood-Schifino got drafted, which TJD obviously had to go. But Hood-Schifino being drafted after 1 year, I think him going one and done was a very poor long-term decision. I get it. You got to capitalize while your value is high. But I really wish Hood-Schifino could have stayed one more year. Could you imagine him with Khalil Ware? especially given the fact that Kel'el Ware is having a phenomenal start to his NBA career with the Miami Heat, as he is in year number 2. He looks poised for a very strong NBA career. He's already having a very good career in the early going. Could you imagine Jalen Hood-Schifino with Kel'el Ware? That team probably would have gotten over the hump, but we'll never know. We'll never know. I wish that Jalen Hood-Schifino stayed. But ever since those guys got drafted, Hood-Schifino and Trace Jackson Davis, Indiana's just been stuck in the water. It's like your car is stuck in mud and you're spinning the wheels, but all you're doing is digging yourself deeper into the mud. There's no sign of an exit. There's no sign of any sort of change to the status quo. And football, Curt Cignetti and his ever anti-complacency attitude, you owe them a lot if you're Scott Dolson, because that's masking a lot of flaws with this program. And as for the women's team, I think the reason that people feel a little bit differently at this point about Teri Moren and company is because they did not have the same season arc that Indiana did. It was almost backwards, I would say. It was almost backwards because the women were bad from the jump. It was a similar in that the roster didn't have depth, but it was a combination of a lack of depth, flawed roster construction, and then injuries. Not too dissimilar from the men's side. But the women took their lumps early on. They showed some flashes at times. You think about the win over Florida State on the road, and in particular then the 106-95 loss to number 10 Iowa State. Iowa State women's basketball, one of the stronger programs in the country right now. And Indiana hung with the Cyclones in that game. Ultimately, the bottom kind of fell out after that because of the injury to Zania Sokaguman and the fact that Shea Chesky was effectively Lamar Wilkerson on steroids in terms of her scoring ability and efficiency. So the bottom kind of fell out for the women. The difference is they showed progress in the latter part of the season. Don't get me wrong, starting Big Ten play 0-10, there's no way around that. That stinks. But some of the losses were close. There are no moral victories in sports. Close losses, 5 points on the road against ranked Nebraska, 3 points at home against ranked Iowa. And then, ultimately, they got things turned around. They beat Northwestern. They ultimately won 6 of their final 8 conference games to close the year. And with a younger roster overall, you figured that this team was going to eventually have something click because Teri Moren pleading with the fan base saying, hey, I haven't forgotten how to coach. Remember that. I haven't forgotten how to coach. We've been snake bitten. We've had bad stretches, but I haven't forgotten how to coach. And ultimately, Indiana ended Nebraska's season kind of taking a page out of the playbook of the Northwestern men's team with what the Wildcats did on Wednesday at the United Center. The Indiana women's team said, hey, well, we're going down, but Nebraska, we're taking you down with us. Indiana came back from 20 points down to beat the Huskers by 3 at Gainbridge Fieldhouse. Nebraska was right on the bubble of the NCAA tournament, and the Huskers will likely not be selected today because of that loss. So the difference between the outlooks for Teri Moren and Darren DeVries, even though their teams actually finished the season with the exact same record, 18-14, is that on the women's side, one, Teri Moren is having all the players who did not do anything transfer out. Jade Onjeneme has entered the transfer portal. Phoenix Stotine in the portal. Faith Wiseman in the portal. And I think the key is that they've actually got key players coming back. Shea Chesky will not come back. That is the biggest loss. One of the biggest losses for any team, just given the production and Chesky's efficiency. 20-plus points per game on 50, 40, 90 splits. Those kinds of players don't just grow on trees. But you saw freshmen actually develop. Wink, wink, nudge, nudge. Didn't happen on the men's side. But it happened on the women's side with the likes of Maya Makaleski and Nevaeh Caffey. Both of whom, again, slow out the gates as expected because Division I athletics has a massive learning curve for a freshman. But Makaleski and Caffey eventually figured some things out. Lene Beaumont will be coming back as a redshirt junior to lead this team. Zania Sokaguman, you would hope, can get healthy and come back at the post position because she was such a big key to Indiana's success going into this season, and ultimately the injuries, they hurt her in the worst way. She did not play a game after January 22nd. She missed the entire month of December. But going into December, she was averaging 13 points and 9 rebounds a game. And Indiana losing that production made it a team that was very weak inside and very one-dimensional at times offensively. But the key for Teri Moren is that, one, she's got another really good recruiting class coming in next year. And she's got young players who have developed in their limited time in college so far. And so the long-term projections for Teri Moren and her program are a lot better than Dara DeVries on the men's side, where DeVries doesn't really have anybody. I mean, you had one freshman on the roster in Trent Sisley who didn't really have the chance to develop. And that is the difference between the men's and the women's teams, is that Moren, it was a down year, but there's some sort of contingency plan moving forward. With the men, it's a giant question mark. You're listening to IU Sports Sunday. Back here on IU Sports Sunday, Nick Rotacap with you. It is unseasonably warm in Bloomington today. IU softball will be in action in just over an hour. I'm going to head over to Andy Moore Field and call that game. The Hoosiers looking to sweep Rutgers and improve to 22-5 in their first 27 games, which will be one of their best starts under Shauna Stanton in the first half of the season. And, well, the end of the campaign is just over a month away, believe it or not. It's going to come at you fast. Big Ten softball play is dense, very action-packed, very tightly packed. 4 or 5 games in a week will do that for you because the season ends May 3rd against Illinois. And, well, Indiana is in position to be in position near the top of the Big Ten when all is said and done, when proceedings settle themselves out. If you haven't been to Andy Moore Field, I encourage you to get out there if you can. Watch a softball game. It's a good atmosphere. The games go pretty quick, actually. And unlike the baseball team, like I said before, you probably won't leave wanting to pull your hair out. This is a fun team. They pitch really well. That's one of the differences between this Indiana team and some past teams just across college softball, is that usually you've got a couple of pitchers, maybe even just one ace that you tend to lean on throughout the season. But Indiana's got a whole stable of arms. They've got a pitching staff, Shauna Stanton said, the Indiana softball head coach, for the first time in a little while. Not just one pitcher doing the heavy lifting. Yesterday it was Ella Trout, the Georgia transfer, who has had a phenomenal start to conference play. She's pitched 13 innings and allowed 1 run. Yesterday, 6 innings of 1-run ball, and that 1 run was a solo home run that she gave up to start the game. But she settled in nicely. 47 2/3 innings for Trout. She is the team's innings leader this year. And she's allowed 12 earned runs. That's an ERA of 1.76. And she is one of 3 Indiana pitchers with a whip of 1 or lower. Walks plus hits per innings pitched, of course. Translation, this is a fun team. Second in the Big Ten in batting average, second in home runs, second in slug, first in stolen bases, and the measurables that Indiana is second in the Big Ten. Well, UCLA is first, and the Bruins have won 18 games in a row. I don't know if they're going to get to Oklahoma's record of 71 consecutive wins that the Sooners set between 2023 and 24. But UCLA is the team to beat in the Big Ten until further notice. Nebraska also up there. Indiana, though, goes out to UCLA in a couple weeks. I would not be surprised at all to see Indiana steal a game. I would not be shocked. It would not surprise me. The thing about college softball is that the gap between the great teams and everybody else is magnified. It's sort of like women's basketball in that respect, in that there's a bit less parity. But Indiana has shown time and time again that it can hang with the perennial powers in college softball. And I'd be very excited for that UCLA series here in a couple weeks for IU softball. Their Big Ten schedule, very favorable. Very favorable. It started with Minnesota, now Rutgers. They'll go out to Maryland next week. And then that trip to UCLA follows the first week of April. There's also a quick 2-gamer with Detroit Mercy in there as well. But should be a fun second half of the season for IU softball. If you haven't been to Andy Moore Field, like I said, get out there, catch a game. It's a fun time. But if you can't be there, I'll be on the call throughout the months of March and April. and into the first couple weeks of May for IU Radio and for Big Ten Plus as well. So we've got you covered in that respect. Happy Selection Sunday. Happy Selection Sunday here in the month of March. Indiana, not going to hear their names called. Big Ten Championship, though, this afternoon. Michigan and Purdue from the United Center. That's two teams obviously very close to Chicago, relatively speaking. Early returns, I was up there until a couple days ago. Early returns would suggest it's going to be a packed house. They've had some good atmospheres this week at the United Center. That's going to do it for IU Sports Sunday. I'm going to get to Andy Moore Field, 11 o'clock first pitch. You can tune in on IUHoosiers.com as Indiana goes for the sweep of Rutgers. But you've been listening to IU Sports Sunday right here on 98.7 The Zone.